Hello, and thank you for tuning in. This is my first time making a podfic out of a fanfiction, and I wanted to thank Ended Flames for allowing me to read their story. I really enjoyed it reading the first time, and I also want to apologize in advance for stuttering in any sense or repeating words. English isn't my mother tongue, and I'm trying to get better with my accent for it and be more, how could you say it, to be more secure with my own self when talking and to better like my own voice. I really appreciate any of the constructive feedback and hope you'll tune in for the next 10 chapters. This fic has a total chapter count of 75, so I'll try to keep the updates as consistent as possible with all day life going on as well. For now, just call me Cole, and I'll hope to read your comments and views next time. Not cut out for heroics? A Boku no Hero fanfiction written by Ended Flames on AO3. Chapter 1. Crushed Dreams. Bang! Izuku didn't flinch. His analysis notebook was thrown out from the window. He didn't turn away. The hand on his shoulder burned through his uniform in seconds. The edges smoked. He held back a whimper as he felt the flesh on his shoulder beginning to burn with it. Not a sound escaped from his mouth as he stared at his childhood friend, his eyes wide with fear and shining with tears.
Why don't you just pray for a quirk in your next life and take a swan dive off the roof?
His eyes only widened at Bakugo's back as he walked away, followed by his cheering gang. It wasn't like it was the first time he'd been told to kill himself. It had happened before, countless times. People had left red spider lilies on his desk. They'd scratched enough threatening messages onto his things for his teachers to bother getting him a new desk and move his locker. It hadn't mattered. He'd only had a clean desk for a day. It has even been told to his face. At this point, Izuku had been told to kill himself more times than he could count. Safe to say, he was numb to it at the point. This time, though, was different. Different because Kachan was saying it. Kachan had never joined in when the taunt was thrown round. Now he had said it himself. Simple as that. Coming from his childhood friend seemed more impactful in a way. It was like it solidified the claim that everyone here hated him. It almost surprised him that he hadn't accepted it before. It made it obvious after all. Izuku sighed, fishing his notebook out of the koi pond. Idly he wondered what was the point in saving it. Anything inside would have been ruined anyway. Maybe he could salvage something. Would there really be a point in trying? Regardless, he'd shaken the majority of the water off and put the notebook back into his backpack. He'd take it home and dry it off later. Trudging through the nearly deserted streets of Musutafu, Izuku finally allowed himself to think about what Kachan had said. He couldn't go through with it. Kachan would get in all sorts of trouble if he did. He did the baiting after all. There's also his mom. She was the only person who'd ever been on his side. He couldn't do that to her. At the same time, it wasn't like he hadn't considered going through with it. In fact, he thought a whole lot about going through with it, even before Kachan said anything. With all the taunts, it really couldn't be helped that the thought crossed his mind. Besides, everyone would be so much happier if he was gone. Most of them had said so themselves. He walked home the same way he always did. It was like none of that had even happened. The only difference was the still smouldering hole in his uniform, and that wasn't exactly unusual either. The walk home was so familiar that he allowed his mind to wander with no issue. Would Kachan feel guilty if he did jump? Would he regret saying what he did? Would his childhood friend even miss him? Izuku doubted it. Kachan didn't give two shits about him. He had made that clear the day Izuku told him he was quirkless. That was the first of many times that he'd been beaten into the ground by his so-called friend. Lost in the memory, he didn't notice the cover of a manhole he'd just walked past pop off. He didn't hear it clatter to the ground nearby, and he definitely didn't hear an oozing mass of sludge ascend from the sewers. He didn't notice the villain behind him until the sludge was wrapping around him, wrapping him up. The thick liquid stuck to his clothes and made it hard to move. It had trapped him before he could scream. When he tried, it forced the sludge down his throat. Izuku let out a muffled yell as he felt the sludge ooze into his lungs. He couldn't breathe. He could feel his throat burning. His vision blurred as he tried to struggle, to rip the villain off of him, to free himself. He kicked out, trying to get away. Eventually he began to tire out, and the sludge monster let out an inhuman laugh. Izuku was going to die. He was going to suffocate. Well, at least Kachan and the others would get what they wanted.
I am here!
Izuku passed out. Izuku woke up to a repetitive tapping on the side of his face. Immediately he'd turned to the side and coughed up the vile liquid, coughing until his throat was sore and then vomiting for good measure. Finally, when he could only taste the stuff in his mouth, he wiped his face with his sleeves and finally took a deep breath. He was alive.
Thank goodness you're okay, kid!
Ultimately, Izuku was pretty sure what he was right now was pretty far from okay. Injured, yes. Tired, yes. Traumatized because he almost died? Almost definitely. Okay? No. But he couldn't argue with All Might, so he had to be okay. Wait. Jolting, Izuku turned to face his savior with wide eyes. He was there! All Might in the flesh! Izuku found energy he didn't know he had as he frantically began searching for his notebook.
Don't worry, kid. I already took the liberty of signing your notebook.
All Might said in his usual booming voice that Izuku had heard so many times on television. He was holding up the notebook to show a double page spread with the hero's signature scrawled across it. Somehow he felt different in person. Izuku grabbed his notebook, quickly making sure the hero hadn't written on any important page, and then mentally vowed to treasure the page forever.
Now I must follow up with the authorities. Thanks, kid!
All Might yelled. Izuku jumped. The hero was going to leave already? But he still wanted to ask, needed to ask. He needed to know if someone like him could be a hero. Wait! All Might, I need...
Sorry, kid. A pro not only battles villains, but time as well.
All Might told him, preparing to jump. Izuku didn't think before leaping forward, grabbing onto the hero's leg, only moments before he left the ground. Maybe he shouldn't have.
Okay, kid.
Just bang on this door and I'm sure someone will let you in."
Wait!
Izuku cried as All Might prepared to leave him on a rooftop. "I cannot wait.
Even without a quirk, can I still be a hero?"
Izuku asked, tears he had been trying to suppress all afternoon beginning to cloud his vision.
Can someone with no power hope to be someone like you?
All Might faltered. Then he deflated. After a lengthy explanation that All Might had hoped he could avoid, Izuku had finally been convinced that he wasn't some imposter. "Now, can someone without a quirk become a hero?" All Might said. His voice seemed more downcast somehow more real than the booming voice he'd been using before. Izuku looked up again. He was finally going to get an answer. No, they can't. It would be far too dangerous. You saw what a villain could do to even me. With no quirk to level the playing field, it would be impossible for someone without a quirk to become a hero. You would be killed almost instantly." Izuku could do nothing but stare. "If you really want to help the people, though, there are other things you could do instead, like become a policeman or join the fire service, maybe become a doctor." Izuku said nothing. The hero probably felt like he was being reassuring. In reality, all he was doing was crushing one of the few things Izuku held on into a million tiny pieces. "It's okay to have dreams, kid. Just make sure they're realistic or achievable." Izuku could barely manage a nod, focusing most of his energy on not bursting into tears right then and there. All Might nodded firmly back at him. "I really have to get that villain to the authorities. Bye, kid." Then he left Izuku there, on a rooftop, alone. He almost laughed. Less than an hour ago he'd been told by his childhood friend to jump off a building. Now here he was, on a rooftop, with no one around to stop him, after just having his dream crushed by the one person he had looked up to and admired since before he even could remember. Instead he just cried. Izuku let out everything he'd been holding in. He sobbed and sobbed until he could face the things he'd been scared to think, and then sobbed some more. It was really hard to believe. The poster that said "Anyone can be a hero" that hung in his room told lies. The hero himself didn't believe the message he spread through the nation. The hero had been his idol, his only hope. When everyone in his life told him he couldn't be a hero, he'd look to that poster and think, "Hey, at least one person still believes in me." Now he knew that was fake too. He had nothing to hold on to. No one thought he could be a hero. There was no point in chasing an impossible dream. So he let it go. It was hard to tell amidst the tears when he'd come to the conclusion. But the time he was done he knew the shattered pieces of his dream had left him. Izuku cried until he was a shaking ball on the roof of this random building, cried over his injuries, cried over the taunts, cried over the loss of a dream. He cried until a kind woman found him, slightly hysterical, on the rooftop. She had brought him downstairs to her apartment, set him down on a comfortable sofa and given him a pillow that he'd immediately clutched, as though it was a lifeline without even realizing it. He wasn't even entirely sure how he'd gotten there. It was just where he was now, and his brain seemed to accept that. A plate of biscuit had
had been placed on the glass coffee table, and a cup of sweet tea was placed in his shaking hands to calm him down until he was breathing normally again. The tea was amazing. It had nicely soothed the burning in his throat. "Hey, kid," she said to him, announcing herself before sitting next to the boy she'd brought down from the roof. "Can you tell me what you were doing up there on the roof?" Izuku stared at his hands, clasped around the teacup, his vision blurred with a few new tears. Again! He hadn't realized they'd escaped his eyes until one splashed into the teacup. He wiped at his face with his sleeve as he aggressively pushed back the tears. It took a moment to look around the apartment. It was well lived in. There were many pictures of what Izuku could only assume was the family living there. 2 women, obviously together, and a younger boy, presumably their son. I'm fine," he said weakly. Don't worry about me." "Hey, I found you near the roof bawling your eyes out," she replied with a sigh. "You're not fine, that's obvious. If you don't want to talk, it's fine, but don't lie about your feelings. My wife's a therapist, and I've learned a thing or two." I wasn't going to," Izuku said quietly, causing a confused look to cross the woman's face. "Jump," Izuku clarified. I wasn't going to jump, if that's what you were thinking. You don't need to worry about me." Oh, you poor kid," she gasped. Hold on, you should have a biscuit. They're chocolate chip. My wife made them, and they're delicious." Silently, Izuku reached over and took a biscuit from the plate. He allowed himself a small smile as he bit into it. Maybe she really did care. He was sure she wouldn't bother with him to cheer him up if she knew about his lack of work. At least the biscuit was good, as she said. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said. Izuku's head snapped up to face her. "If you just want to sit here for a while, I'm fine with that. If you want to go, that's fine too. But please talk to someone about whatever is troubling you." Are you sure? It feels like I'm intruding," Izuku whispered. "You aren't intruding, kid. If I didn't want you here, I wouldn't have brought you in the first place," she assured, sitting back down next to him and taking a cookie for herself. "Feel free to take as many as you want." What's your quirk?" Izuku asked, breaking the silence that had fallen over them for the past 5 minutes. Part of him trying to relieve the tense silence. The other part was simply curious. "Oh, it's really not that interesting," she admitted. "My skin is a lot more resilient than normal people's." "That's interesting! It's really cool! Does it make it harder for you to injure yourself? Does it mean you're more resistant to things like the disease as well?" Izuku stopped himself, realizing that he was about to go off on a tangent, something that Kachan would have always been annoyed at. "Sorry, I started rambling." She just laughed, waving off his apology. "Don't worry about it, I don't mind." About 10 minutes of small talk and quiet conversation later, the woman never pushed him and never got annoyed. The front door of the apartment opened and a boy came in, about Izuku's age, with floppy black hair. Izuku guessed he was the boy from the pictures, the woman's son. "Hey Mom, I'm home! Who's that?" he asked, looking at Izuku. There was nothing but confusion in his voice, but still Izuku tensed up. Worry flooded his thoughts. What if the boy went to his middle school? What if he was one of the bullies? And what if he knew Izuku? What if... Hey, Eiichiro, come have a cookie, the woman grinned, waving him over. This is... What's your name? Sorry, I forgot to ask. Izuku Midoriya. Nice to meet you. Izuku managed to squeak out, pushing his worries aside. Surely he couldn't be a bad person with a parent like her. He's a little shy. She smiled sadly, and upset. I've been trying to cheer him up. Midoriya, this is my son. I'm Eiichiro Kirishima. That's my mom. Nice to meet you too. The other boy grinned, showing pointed teeth. Izuku allowed himself a nervous smile. I should go. Thank you for everything. It's just my mom's probably worried about me, and tell your wife her cookies are amazing. Izuku rambled, standing abruptly and grabbing his bag. The boy's arrival had spiked his anxiety. He didn't want to stay here. Thank you. Just remember you're always welcome here if you need anything, the woman called. He waved to her and her son, and then slipped out of the door, closing it quietly behind him, before sprinting for the staircase. As Izuku walked home, the events of the day began to take their toll on him. The tea and cookies had definitely given him an energy boost, but now he felt like all he wanted to do was collapse on his bed and sleep for a year. That afternoon had been eventful. So much had happened, and it left him feeling more drained than anything else. He decided to check his phone as he went. The villain attack had made the headlines. Izuku brushed it off, unable to find it in him to care. Suddenly, though, his eyes were drawn to it, when he realized something was off. Isn't that the villain All Might saved me from? The one he captured? Looking closer at the picture attached with the article, he realized that the boy that the villain was attacking was scarily familiar. Kachan! Izuku stopped leaning against the lamppost to read the article, his attention now captivated. Is Kachan okay? How did the villain escape All Might? What happened? It turns out that All Might had arrived just in time to save him. Everything was okay. Was it his fault? The thought hit him like a brick. It wasn't it? All Might must have dropped the villain when Izuku grabbed onto him. He had wasted the hero's time, so he couldn't have acted sooner. Kachan could have died, and it was all his fault. Fresh tears welled in Izuku's eyes as he continued the journey home. He sat down, lost in thoughts. He had just about managed to compose himself by the time he reached his apartment. His mom hadn't suspected anything was wrong when he told her he'd been out with a new friend. She didn't question him when he said he'd wanted to get to bed early. Izuku stared at his room. Everywhere he looked, All Might was staring back at him. The posters, the figurines, the onesies hanging in his closet, the stickers, every inch of his room was covered with the hero. Before today, they could comfort him. All Might was his motivation to keep going, to keep being a hero. It would be impossible for someone without a quirk to become a hero. The words his idols had spoken to him earlier that way bounced around his head. Tears threatened to spill from his eyes again as he pushed the thoughts away. Instead, Izuku settled for collapsing on his bed. He was asleep before his head hit the pillow. Chapter 2. New Ideas. The next day was a Saturday. Saturdays meant no school first and foremost. It meant he had a day free of torment and injuries. Saturdays were one of the only 2 days that didn't seem to be out to get him. Even better, his mom was working out of the house, and Izuku had the day to himself. He could do whatever he wanted, without being asked questions. Don't get him wrong, he loved his mom. How could he not with a parent like Inko, but sometimes it was nice to be alone. The morning had been spent ridding his room of All Might. He'd taken down all of his All Might posters and packed them neatly into boxes. He'd replaced his duvet covers with a plain dark green one he'd found in the storage cupboard. He'd cleared away a lot of All Might figurines. He had peeled a lot of the All Might stickers off where he could and cleaned up the spots they'd left. The All Might themed curtains were unhooked from the railing and neatly folded. The rug was rolled. He'd packed up his limited edition hoodies and clothes. The merchandise had been replaced with what little he currently had of other heroes. There was a Wild Pussycats poster he'd gotten from a convention years ago that had all the 4 members' signatures. He wondered why he'd never put it up before. And a poster for President Mike's radio show. Couple of figurines now replaced the many he'd had on his shelves, one of Gang Orca and another of Ryukyu. A few more or lesser known heroes, nowhere nearly as many as he'd had of All Might. Looking over the 6 boxes of All Might themed things, he considered throwing them all away. There and then, and the only thing that stopped him was the fact that he'd spent so much money on all this. All this crap would probably be an environmental hazard if he threw it away anyway. The conclusion he came to after a short while was that he'd sell as much as he could. He'd probably make a fortune from it, especially if the signed 20th anniversary limited edition poster he'd gotten at a hero event somewhere. Besides, it would definitely make some other people happy. He'd have to work through it later, though. So for now he'd just push the boxes under his bed. Looking around his room, it was almost like it was new. It almost looked like he'd never been there. It looked empty. Izuku sighed. He really didn't like the lack of merchandise, but it was definitely better than them being there. Maybe he could buy a few posters of other heroes. Thinking about it, he wasn't sure why he'd been so fixated on All Might. Seeing his room so empty made him realize how much he'd put the guy on a pedestal. There were so many other cool heroes out there that were worth his appreciation too. After a quick look through the internet, he'd selected a bunch of posters and figurines and other merchandise from some heroes' official stores, and quickly ordered them all. Afterwards, he realized that despite the work he'd done in his room, it was only noon. Izuku sighed again, grabbing some lunch for himself and deciding on a whim to head out of the apartment for a simple walk. Bit of fresh air. Maybe he could spend the time trying to come up with something to do. He had barely gotten to the corner of the street before an idea hit him like a brick. Or maybe more like a YouTube ad that did, the piece of paper having blown straight into his face. What if Izuku made a YouTube channel? His brain buzzed with the thought as he continued his walk. It would be an outlet for all his thoughts, meaning maybe he'd mutter less. Maybe he could even help out some people who are struggling with quirks, or even aid pro heroes with improving their own quirks and fighting styles. And he'd be able to use his analysis where he wouldn't be using it for heroics anymore. Shaking his head, Izuku turned around to head back to the apartment. Making a quick stop at the convenience store to buy himself a new notebook, as well as some basic craft supplies. He'd need a way to hide his identity after all. During the walk back, Izuku began to worry. As much as he tried to push the thoughts out of his mind, they'd continued to come back. I'm not a quark specialist. What if the channel gets taken down? What if someone from school recognizes me, and what if a pro-hero doesn't like what I say and sends their legal team after me? What if... Izuku shut down the spiral. He had already accepted he wouldn't get many subs and views. There were so many better people out there, so why would they choose to watch him? Despite all that, he still wanted to go through with his idea. For himself, if no one else. Grinning, Izuku held up the finished product to the light. He had carefully designed a mask, using what materials he had around. Sitting at his desk with a glue gun, surrounded by cut pieces of fabric and other such crafty materials, Izuku finally had his final product. The mask had a somewhat simple pattern, since Izuku wasn't experienced in design, but it covered his face fine. It was similar in the style of a traditional masquerade mask, though it covered a little more of his face and pushed back his hair at the sides. He decided on a vacuum leaf pattern, multiple green leaf shapes fanning out from the bridge of his nose. It matched his hair, for one, as well as the fact that leaves symbolized revival and hope. Izuku had decided that reflected his new goals pretty well. He wanted a new dream. This was a new start, a second try, a more realistic dream. He put on one of his favorite hoodies, a dark green one, along with the mask, and pulled the hood up. He smiled at his reflection. Other than a small bit of green hair poking out at the front, he believed that he was pretty much unrecognizable by looks. Perfect! With his outfit picked out, he pulled out the new notebook and opened it to the first page, quickly jotting down the title. Number 1. First video. The title wasn't important, he'd come up with it later. His mind wondered what he should call his channel. He'd have to think hard about that one. It was almost like a hero name in a sense. The name of his channel would be what everyone will call him. If he ever gains a following, that is. He needed to come up with something good. And his mind was cast back to his childhood, when he had come up with All Might-centered hero names. I was stupid back then, wasn't I? Leaning back in his chair, the end of the pen grinding between his teeth, he began to think seriously. What if I just call myself Hero Stalker Boy or something else stupid? Well, maybe he wasn't totally thinking seriously. Another 20 minutes later, he decided to pull that off as well. For now, and just begin writing the script for the first video, making sure to keep it vague enough that it allowed him to use his own words, but still keep him on a track. He really didn't want to go off on a mumbling tangent. His mom had come home while he was working on writing a rough script for the first video he planned to make, one analyzing Kamui Woods, who he'd seen in action just the morning before. She'd peek into his room, silently noting the drastic change in decor that had appeared over the day. She noticed him hard at work and assumed that he was busy doing homework or his analysis, and decided to leave him until dinner. So, what have you been up to, Izuku? Where did all your All Might stuff go? Inko asked him curiously as they sat together at the table in their apartment. It's all under my bed. I was thinking of selling it and getting some new posters. I thought it was time for a change is all. Izuku told her, a lovely bright smile on his face. Somehow Inko could tell that it didn't quite reach his eyes. She knew her son was lying. Really? But you've always been a huge fan of All Might. This seems like a sudden change. Did something happen? Inko asked, looking worriedly at her son. She knew he hid some things from her. She'd seen the burns and bruises he'd come home from school with sometimes. But when she asked him about it, he'd close off and refuse to tell her. She knew pushing would only make it worse, so she left it alone. But it was definitely new. Inko was worried something bad had happened. "It's really nothing, Mom," Izuku said, keeping a smile on his face. "I just thought maybe I should look into some other heroes." Inko sighed. He wasn't going to tell her then. Maybe if she asked something else, she could get a proper conversation going. "So what else have you done today?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Maybe he'd tell her that. And Izuku visibly lit up. "I had a new idea. I thought maybe instead of being a hero, I could focus on my analysis to help people. So I thought maybe I could start a YouTube channel where I could share my analysis." He looked at her hopefully, watching her reaction to this new master plan of his as he'd spent all afternoon on it. Inko knew she could shut down his new bright idea with just one word. She knew that he would give it up if she asked. But Inko didn't want to do that. She smiled. "That sounds like a great idea, Izuku." Inko cheered, clapping her hands happily. "You have my full support!" She watched as relief flooded her son's face. "Thanks, Mom." He grinned, a genuine smile for once. "I hoped you would." "Does this mean you don't want to go to UA anymore either?" Inko asked somewhat carefully. She didn't want her son to think that that was all she wanted out of this. She wanted him to make his own choices, but I didn't even think about that. Izuku said thoughtfully, "I still want to go. Maybe I don't really know. I'll think about it. I'm not going to try for the hero course anymore. I don't think I can be a hero." "Oh, baby," Inko sighed. "Just know that I'll support you no matter what you choose to do, okay?" That night, Izuku thought about it as he tried to sleep. He had finished the first script that evening after dinner, and he planned to record the video tomorrow once he'd thought of the channel name and gotten everything ready, of course. But his mom's question hadn't left his mind. Did he still want to go to UA? Of course, Izuku knew the school had other courses as well as the hero ones. There was support, business and general studies. He'd wanted to go to the school since he knew it existed, and he wasn't naive enough to believe it was just a hero school. He supposed he could maybe go for the support or business courses, but they didn't really offer what he wanted. Besides, he could rather be a hero than a businessman. He doubted he'd be a great inventor of tech support either. Maybe he could do general studies? The course was often frowned upon simply because it wasn't specialized. It was basically a normal high school course, but he'd be taught by pro heroes. Plus he might get to meet the hero course students and take part in the sports festival. Maybe it wasn't a normal high school course, but it was the closest UA had. Izuku grabbed his laptop, navigating the browser to UA's website and looking over the courses, clicking on the Gannett course. The entrance requirements were almost trivial, scoring within the top 50 participant on a written exam. The other 10 places in the course were given to those who failed the hero course exam, but came close, of course. Usually more places were given here though, since not many people tended to apply for Gannett by itself. Alternatively, applicants could take both the Gannett exam and the exams for another course, in which case Gannett would serve as a backup.
Izuku smiled. With some good studying, he was sure he'd have a good chance of getting in. He took a glance over at the subjects they'd be studying. None of them seemed horrendous or overly bad in general. Izuku tended to enjoy learning and wasn't overly against many school subjects after all. He only hated going to school because of the bullying and mistreatment, not because of the actual lessons as a normal kid might. A qualification from UA would surely mean he could go places even if he was quirkless. You cannot be a hero without a quirk. Sighing, he put his laptop back onto his desk and turned over in his bed, his thoughts swarming his head once again. Yeah, he'd had a productive day today. He'd done what All Might had told him and found a new dream. He'd realized he still might have a chance at UA. But was there really a point? Other than his mother, no one Izuku knew really cared for him. Kachan wanted him dead. He'd said so himself, and everyone else in middle school would be glad to see him gone too. The thoughts piled on top of him once again, trying to crush him beneath their weight. He pushed back with feeble goals he had. Help people with his analysis. Get into UA, scan Ed's course. Don't let Kachan find out what he was doing. Those were the 3 things he wanted to achieve. He had 10 months to achieve them. Pretty pathetic, but it was all he had. Chapter 3. Ryoku Analysis. Izuku stared blankly at his laptop screen. He'd set up the channel after breakfast that morning, but he was still stuck on a name. What about Mastermind? No, that sounded too much like a villain name. He didn't want to seem like a villain. Something simple like Hero Analysis? That wouldn't work either. It was so boring, no one would remember him with a name like that. He continued to think, a list of name ideas collecting up in the back of his notebook. Most of them already crossed out. They weren't good enough. Then an idea popped into his head. A better idea than all the other ideas. What if he just wrote his name differently? He had already thought about just using Deku, a different interpretation of the kanji making up Izuku, meaning useless. But if Kachan came across him on the internet, he'd recognize that. It was a nickname after all, too obvious. As well as the fact that he didn't really want to go by useless. For the rest of his life, it was enough being constantly called that in school. So that was out. Maybe he could try rewriting Midoriya. That could work. Izuku ended up with Ryoku, another way of reading Midori. Also another pronunciation of the kanji for strength, which was nice. People would probably guess that was the meaning. Throwing people off the trail? Yeah, that could work. So Izuku finally had a name for his channel, Ryoku Analysis, and he was all set to publish a first video. Maybe I should get to filming that. An hour later and Izuku was busy going through the footage. Recorded on his phone, not the best quality, but he could buy a better camera later down the line if he needed. Cutting out bits where he went on long off-topic tangents. Time was spent adding pictures and diagrams where necessary and watching over it a few times, checking for any major mistakes that he'd need to fix. After a final review, Izuku decided to use some online software to alter his voice a little. Not so much that it seemed robotic or weirdly pitched, just enough that his voice wasn't immediately recognized. This was a secret identity, right? Finally, he was happy with the video. The mouse pointer hovered over the publish button. Of course, that was the moment where the self-doubt decided to creep up on him. What if it wasn't good enough?
What if everyone hates it? Would Kachan or anyone from school recognize him? If they did, what would they do? They'd surely come after him. He couldn't risk that. The thoughts came crashing down on him like a wave. He felt tears escape his eyes as the screen blurred in front of him. No one would like him. He'd just get hate. Why would anyone watch a useless nobody ramble about heroes anyway? Was there a point in any of this? Izuku stood up before he began to openly sob, curling in on himself as he tried and tried to stop the tears from falling. He couldn't do this. What's the point in posting a video he's only going to get hate for anyway? No need to ruin his already dwindling mental health after all. This was a stupid idea in the end. He snatched up his notebook and a pen as he left the bedroom, quickly writing a note to explain his mother where he had gone. She herself had gone out for groceries just 15 minutes previously, and he fled their apartment. Sighing, Izuku trudged along the pavement. He didn't know where he was going, mind wandering as he allowed his feet to steer his body without his input. As he walked, his mind went to other places. He still had to copy out the notes from his ruined notebook. Speaking of, he had forgotten to put it somewhere to dry, hadn't he? And now it was probably soaked in sewage from the sludge monster as well. Oh well, maybe it was further beyond saving than he'd thought. The smell of rotting rubbish brought him out of his thoughts. At first he'd wondered if thinking of sewage had him imagining the smell, before he realized where he had arrived. The Goba Beach Park was even worse than he remembered. The piles of rubbish illegally dumped on the beach reached towards the sky. It was disgusting, really. Izuku could picture how it used to be when his mother and Aunt Mitsuki brought him and Kachan here during the summer before Izuku was diagnosed quirkless. It had been a day trip every time. He only had fond memories of this place before the trash began to build up on the sands and their parents had stopped bringing them as it became more and more unsafe to be here. And then people had started illegally dumping their waste here and it had become unusable. Despite that, though, he had still continued to come here when the bullying was at its worst. It was a perfect place to hide among the dense small, but he was small too. Piles of rubbish that had just been building then. He was pretty sure he had stashed some medical supplies somewhere around here for the worst days, but he hadn't been here in years. He couldn't remember the spot he had cleared to set up camp. It was probably gone now with the growth of the trash piles. At first Izuku tried picking up trash when it came. He do his part for the community and moved what he could, bottles and bags and smaller scrap pieces, but eventually he had given up. The amount of trash was too much for a lonely 7-year-old boy to clear. Maybe he could try and clear it up now? Perhaps he could post on some social media groups and recruit some people. See if anyone would provide transport for the bigger items and see if anyone was willing to do their bit moving the smaller things. That was something he could think about later though. Besides, he'd need to focus on the YouTube idea first. That is, if he ever found the courage to post the first video. Izuku returned home an hour later from his walk. He'd successfully managed to avoid bumping into anyone from Eldera. Luckily. On his laptop he found the note from his mom. He could tell it was her writing, and who else would actually leave him a note? Telling him that she thought the video was amazing and people would love it. I doubt it. But maybe he shouldn't give up so soon. His mom believed in him after all. It wasn't much.
but the small boost of confidence was nice. So he screwed his eyes and clicked the button. A moment of panic as his computer pinged and a box came up. "Everything's fine. Just a confirmation message. You can do it, Izuku." So he hit the yes option and there was an almost satisfying ping sound as his video was loaded up and published. It's out in the world now. No going back. Izuku leaned back in his chair with a sigh of relief. A new feeling blossoming in his chest. A similar feeling to when he got a good grade in school, or did particularly good analysis pages, or made his mother smile, that rare but small, genuine smile. It was pride. Now he just had to wait for the fall. Chapter 4. Positivity, Cleaning and Katsuki Bakugo. The next morning, Izuku was nervous to check his notifications. He doubted anyone had watched his video, but still, if anybody had. So Izuku did the reasonable thing and put off starting up his laptop until he got home from school later. School itself was thoroughly uninteresting. He ran from Kachan and got embarrassed in front of the class by his English teacher. He'd never been good at English. He spent lunch trying to eat his bento and run from bullies at the same time. He'd come home with an unusually small amount of bruises. He'd been lucky, he thought. Well, lucky since Kachan told him to. You know. He'd been really lucky, since he had his dreams crushed by his idol. Maybe he hadn't been all that lucky. That morning he had considered asking if Chika-chan was okay. After he'd read about the sludge villain incident, he was pretty sure Kachan had almost died. But the look in the boy's eyes was practically daring him to ask, so he thought better of it. After school he'd put off reading, comments further still by completing the homework he'd been set that day and doing a bit of analysis from a news report, some heroes taking down a villain in another city. But once he'd finally exhausted his options for procrastination, he opened up his laptop. Well, that's new. His video had a couple hundred views already. Only a day in, he'd gained a good number of subscribers too. Staring at the screen, slightly in shock, Izuku moved to the comment section, mentally preparing himself for the hate. Hate that wasn't there besides 1 or 2 comments. Izuku's eyes widened as he read through the comments. The positivity left on the video. Comments saying he couldn't wait to see more, that they loved his analysis, that it was interesting or cool. People liked him! One of the most liked comments was a request on a video on Mount Lady, the new hero who had debuted only last Friday. "Hey Ryoku, that's your name, right? I was wondering if you took requests. If so, please do, Mount Lady. I loved the video." It had almost as many likes as there were viewers. "She already has a following, huh? Well, she is the kind of hero who just draws attention with no effort. With a quirk and revealing costume, it's no wonder she already has a huge fan base. Maybe that could be his next video." Izuku decided that could wait for now. He had around 10 months to prepare for UA, not just the entrance exam. He knew he didn't need strength to be accepted into Gannett, but it would still be nice to do some kind of training, so he didn't make a total fool of himself in front of everyone for being a weak, quirkless nobody. Of course, he'd still be a quirkless nobody, but at least he wouldn't be as weak. Maybe cleaning up the Gobat beach would be some good strength training. And running to and from the beach could help with his endurance. Maybe he could even look up some fighting techniques and use rubbish on the beach to help him train. Izuku began to draft up a rough training plan, and once he'd done that, began working on the script for his next video featuring Mount Lady. Maybe he should start videoing some of the villain chases he came across. It might be useful to have some real footage in his videos. The next day, after barely escaping school, Kachan had been on his tail, but Izuku knew he wouldn't attack once they were on the street. Izuku jogged home, grabbed a few snacks and a water bottle, and left a note for his mom telling her he'd be home a few hours late, and set off again. Another jog later and he'd arrive at the beach park, tired and out of breath already. Yeah, he definitely needed to work on endurance. Once he'd finally caught his breath, he began picking up the trash from the beach. Small things at first, bottles and packaging and the like, slowly filling up the few bags he'd brought to carry to the rubbish. He didn't worry about the scratches and cuts accumulating on his hands from the broken glass. He'd built up an incredible pain tolerance from being around Katsuki, and he could just bandage them up later. Once he'd filled all the bags he could carry, he took them over to the dumpster outside of a nearby apartment building. After repeating this process a couple more times, using all of the bags he had brought with him, and filling up about half of the dumpster, he sure hoped the landlord wouldn't mind. Izuku realized he'd barely made a dent. Sure, there was less plastic and glass lying around, but the heaps of bigger things, appliances, furniture, trash bags full of junk and other such items that definitely wouldn't fit in the black bags were still there. He wondered how he'd get rid of them. As he walked home, tired out from cleaning as much as he did so far, he realized he'd probably have to get help. Hire a skip or someone to take away the bigger things. Maybe he could ask on some forum if anyone was in the market for old appliances. Over the next 2 months, Izuku continued to make videos, analyzing new and upcoming heroes, mainly those requested and those who were currently climbing the popularity charts. He'd decided not to venture into the top 10 yet, since he was worried about losing interest, as well as the possibility of upsetting and or angering the heroes themselves if he said something bad to upset or offend anyone. He had also begun to make analysis videos on villains, big villains that heroes have yet to capture, figuring there must be villains profiting off of his analysis as well as the heroes, so he may as well make it even, or give the heroes more leverage. He just wanted his channel to work in heroes' favor. The subscriber count on his videos increased with every passing day. He now had around 100,000 subs. Something in the back of his mind told him that that wasn't exactly normal, but he would never admit that he was doing better than most channels. Because why would he be? He was simply a Deku, a worthless, quirkless nobody. After asking around on multiple community forums, he'd found a couple people willing to take the bigger trash items he removed from Dagoba for free, apparently dealing in that sort of thing. That wasn't illegal as far as he knew. He'd begun to make a dent in the dumping ground of Dagoba as well. There was a small patch of empty sand where you could look straight to the sea. Izuku knew he wasn't close to finishing, but he was glad for the progress. As far as school went, it didn't exactly improve, almost the opposite actually. Izuku was grateful for that 1 week where Kachan was recovering from almost dying, but it really didn't last long. Over the last week it had become harder and harder to avoid Kachan, who was very obviously worked up over something. He had been coming up with different means of escape, some more extravagant and dangerous than others. Most included running for his life. His favorite so far was climbing out of the 3rd floor classroom window and escaping through the trees like some kind of ninja. Though he wouldn't do that again, he remembered almost falling and really didn't want to go through that again. He knew Kachan would catch on soon enough though. He knew his plans weren't good enough to throw the explosive classmate off of his scent for that long. Terrified of the day he was caught, Izuku kept running. Katsuki Bakugo was not happy. It had been 2 months since the slime incident, or as he liked to know it, the time I almost died because of some incompetent heroes couldn't do their fucking jobs. After that incident, Katsuki had noticed a change in the damn nerd. He knew the nerd was getting stronger. How? Katsuki had no idea. Obviously the nerd thought he was better, training in secret and defying Katsuki and his group of extras to sneak away somewhere after school. Deku seemed happier too. Katsuki wanted to know what was going on, and he would find out eventually, when he finally caught Deku. He was obviously still training to be a hero. His previous beatings must not have been enough. Tch! He'd have to teach the stupid, quirkless loser a lesson later. Anyway, Katsuki wasn't usually the type to sit around and watch videos, but lately a new YouTuber had caught his eyes. Some random kid posting videos on hero analysis, Ryoku or something. Out loud, Bakugo would never admit that he liked them. That would be like saying he liked Deku's annoying muttering. But he couldn't deny that they were interesting to say the least. He totally hadn't watched every video Ryoku had posted to see if he could find any ways to improve his quirk. No, because he was the best, and he didn't need to improve because his quirk was the best. He was amazing. Absolutely no question about it. He was on the fast track of becoming the #1 hero. He didn't need tips on how to avoid accidentally burning himself with his explosions, or avoiding the very real possibility of going deaf, or generally better ways to use his quirk. Not Katsuki, never Katsuki, because Katsuki was perfect. That's what he believed, and that's what he always was told. Chapter 5. Bakugo and Aizawa. 3 months had gone by since Izuku posted his first video, almost to the day. Unfortunately, that didn't mean there would be any extra luck in his favor. It seemed like the opposite, actually. That day had gone not really well at all. It had started like any normal day. He had checked over the comments of his newest video, one about a villain who'd been hunting down and killing pro-heroes a few cities over, replying to a few questions and liking a few comments. He'd left the house smiling. The good mood didn't exactly last long though. The jeering in the corridors had worsened, and more nasty insults were sent his way. He had been pushed to the floor on the way to class, slammed against the wall of lockers in the process, and left there. That was going to leave a bruise. After making sure nothing was badly damaged, he had made his way to class. His teacher called him out for being a few minutes late. Izuku attempted to explain, his voice shaky and timid, but the teacher waved away his explanation as another poor excuse, and sent him to his seat with detention as the class laughed at him.
Izuku fought to keep the tears at bay when his lunch was stolen from him by a couple of Kachan's lackeys. The food was tossed on the ground and ruined at his feet. He got scolded by a teacher 10 minutes later for making a mess and was told to get rid of this filth. He couldn't help but think they were referring to him rather than the ruined lunch. The worst part was that Kachan didn't make an attempt to ambush him after school. He was planning something. Izuku found out what that was on his way home after he'd set his detention. A whole other ordeal that he really didn't have the emotional capacity for today. As he was walking down an empty street about halfway from his school to his apartment building, he was grabbed roughly by the wrist and yanked hard into the alleyway, hard enough to fall into a pile of bags of trash. At first he thought it was a villain attack. Then he heard the familiar popping explosions of Kachan's quirk. Izuku made the mistake of trying to run. Katsuki simply hit him in the back with an explosion, causing him to topple forward, hissing as he felt the pain from the burns left from the explosion on his back.
"What have you been up to, Deku?"
Kachan sneered, walking around, crouching down so he was within Izuku's line of sight.
I don't know what you mean,"
Izuku whispered, his voice shaking as he replied.
"You know exactly what I mean, you damn nerd!"
Kachan yelled, grabbing Izuku by the collar of his shirt and hauling him up to standing before punching him hard in the jaw and sending him toppling back into the trash. Izuku couldn't hold back a whimper as his burned back made contact with the shiny, sticky materials of the bags. That hurt like heck.
"Don't think I haven't noticed,"
Katsuki continued, leaning over and pinning Izuku down with a hand on his shoulder. Izuku stared at the hand, eyes widening as pain blossomed from the spot. Another burn. This was getting bad.
"I can see you've been training. You still think you can be a hero, Deku? Well, answer me!"
When Izuku tried out to mutter a quiet no, Kachan punched him again. If his jaw wasn't dislocated at least before, it definitely was now. Izuku's eyes darted around, panicked, looking for some form of escape, but there was nothing. He felt something warm on his face as he was punched again. That was blood. Was his nose bleeding? Probably. He could barely feel the pain anymore. He realized he was numb. His vision was going black. No, don't pass out. I can't pass out. Stop! Kachan fired off another explosion, badly burning his shoulder, though he could barely feel it. Another punch. Another burn. He was slipping away. His vision was going black as he fell out of consciousness. The last thing he saw was Kachan standing up and leaving him there. I guess that's what happens if you avoid Kachan for months. Eraserhead hated this patrol route, jumping between rooftops, searching for crimes to stop, villains to apprehend. Mainly it was mugging or purse snatching. Easy stuff to deal with. Knock out the villain, call the police, wait for them to arrive and be on his way. Today was different though. Something felt off, as if something different was going to happen. It was only 20 minutes into his patrol when he spotted something strange from his perch on the rooftops, his favorite spot to watch crime in this area. He saw a boy lying in an alleyway, barely noticeable amongst the bags of trash. From a distance, he couldn't tell the boy's condition. He could simply be a rough sleeper. On the other end of the spectrum, he could be left for dead by a villain, for all he knew. So he had to check it out, if the kid was in trouble or dead. Eraserhead hoped not, certainly. He might have to call the police to find out what happened, and hey, if he was a rough sleeper, he could always help him out. He was sure he had some spare change in a pocket somewhere. When he got to the alleyway in question, he was glad he decided to check it out. The boy was unconscious. Thank God he wasn't dead. He didn't want to deal with the paperwork. With a multitude of injuries ranging in severity, from bruising to what looked like a third-degree burn on his shoulder, as well as possibly broken jaw. How long has this kid been here? Eraserhead shook his head. Priorities. He had to get this kid to a hospital, and quickly, before the wounds got infected. Carefully he set about picking up the boy, only to realize there was yet another burn on his back. He settled for wrapping his capture weapon around the boy, trying his best not to agitate the burns. The material of his scarf was supposed to be soft when it was wound up like this. In any case, it would be better than the bags of rubbish the boy had been lying on before. After he had the boy in a position where he shouldn't get more injured and would at least be a little comfortable, he made a beeline for Musutafu General Hospital, where he managed to get the boy an urgent help. He was told by a receptionist to wait before he very aggressively showed her the boy's condition and explained the situation. He was currently getting surgery to fix him up as best as the doctors could, while Aizawa attempted to work out who exactly he was. The only things he had on his person were his phone and school ID. At least that gave him a name, Izuku Midoriya. The kid's phone was easy. He didn't have a password protection. He definitely was going to tell the kid to add that when he woke up. He only had a few contacts, but the one he was looking for there was labeled helpfully under Mom. Aizawa didn't hesitate to call the number, forgetting about the awkward conversation that would follow. "Izuku?" His mother answered the phone frantically. "Baby, are you okay? Where are you?" It was obvious from her voice that she'd been crying. Damn it. "Is this Mrs. Midoriya?" Aizawa asked awkwardly. He almost heard the woman on the other end of the phone jump when she realized it wasn't her son on the phone. Yes, that's me. Who are you and how did you get my son's phone?" she asked, the frantic tone not dropping from her voice. "I am Underground Hero Eraserhead. I found your son about 20 minutes ago, unconscious in an alleyway, with multiple serious injuries. He is currently being treated in Musutafu General Hospital." Aizawa explained as simple and straightforward as he could. "Oh my God," she whispered. Is my baby going to be okay?" "He should be. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten an update yet, so I'm not entirely sure. He's getting emergency treatment right now," Aizawa explained. Thank you for calling me. I'm on my way," Mrs. Midoriya breathed before hanging up. Aizawa sighed, picking up his own phone and calling Hitsashi. 10 minutes later, a frantic green-haired woman burst through the doors of the hospital, heading straight to the front desk, demanding to know the condition of Izuku Midoriya. Aizawa reluctantly got out of his seat and approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm Eraserhead. I called you earlier," he explained simply. "Oh, I'm Inko Midoriya. You said you saved my son?" Inko asked him, her voice shaky with tears running down her face. Aizawa carefully led her to where he had been sitting. "That's right." "Is he okay? What happened to him?" Inko almost pleaded to know. "I found him in an alleyway. He was unconscious and had a few serious injuries. I assume he'd been involved in a villain attack, multiple burns and a broken jaw." Aizawa explained as if he was filing a report as a nurse came over. "Hello, I'm Nurse Akiyama. I have news about Izuku Midoriya, she told him, glancing at Inko. I'm his mother. Please tell me is my baby okay? Inko practically pleaded with the nurse, who relaxed, knowing she was a relative. We had to give him emergency treatment to fix his jaw. He will make a full recovery though. He won't be able to speak for a while due to a sad broken jaw. It needs to heal, and the burns on his shoulder and back in particular will need time to heal as well, she explained. We'll probably keep him in the hospital for a week or so just to monitor recovery. And then if all's well, we'll discharge him, and you'll be able to take care of him at home. Oh, thank you! Everything! Inko breathed, wiping at the tears on her face. Is he awake? Can I see him? He's still currently unconscious, but they're removing him to a recovery ward as we speak, so you'll be able to see him soon, she reassured. Inko nodded before looking at the Eraserhead. Thank you so much for saving my son, she told him. Aizawa just nodded. I am going to have to ask him a few questions once he wakes up, about what happened and such, Aizawa explained, just as protocol, and hopefully we are able to catch the villains who did this. I understand, Inko nodded. I'd like to know what happened too, if that's okay. Of course. My name
Chapter 6. Hospital Questioning. Izuku woke up to a pounding in his head and a numb feeling everywhere else. After a few attempts, he found he couldn't move. Am I dead? He blinked his eyes open. At least he could do that. But all he saw was some kind of ceiling. The panels were evenly spaced out with an industrial light in the center. As feeling began to return to his fingers, Izuku realized he was on a bed, the covers pulled up to his chest. He attempted to lift up his arm, abruptly giving that up as a shot of pain went through his shoulder. He let out a quiet hiss of pain as feeling returned to the rest of his body, the pain in his shoulder dulling down to a painful stinging rather than feeling as if he'd just been stabbed. There was a similar pain in his back, plus the pounding on the back of his head. The rest of his body ached too, not in the same way, but it ached. His face hurt more than the rest of his body. He felt that he couldn't move his jaw or turn his head. There was something keeping his head in place. What on earth happened to me? Izuku laid still. Obviously he was supposed to do, since he couldn't move much else, and tried to unscramble his thoughts. The pounding in his head. He felt like he'd been whacked with a sledgehammer or something, making it a lot more difficult than he liked. Hey kid, you're awake? A gruff voice made Izuku jump, something he regretted instantly as pain shot through his body again. Did wherever he was not have painkillers or something? Izuku tried to nod, finding he still couldn't move, and instead put his hand on the opposite arm he'd lifted earlier up and gave whoever was in the room a thumbs up. Whoever it was fought to contain a laugh. Can we sit you up? Came a woman's voice, not one he recognized. There are some people who here to see you. Another thumbs up, and the woman pressed something, causing the bed he was lying on to raise slightly, almost like a dentist's chair. Once Izuku was in position where he could see more than just the ceiling, he glanced around, taking in all the details of the room. It was full of medical equipment, another bed that was empty, a woman, he guessed that she was the one who spoke before, and wait, was that Eraserhead? Izuku was in a hospital. He tried to say something, but the doctor interrupted his attempt quickly. "Try not to speak," she told him. "You had a broken jaw and we had to perform emergency surgery to put it back in place. You could damage it or interrupt recovery if you attempt to speak." Izuku resorted to the thumbs up. He still couldn't nod. He realized he had a neck brace on, probably to stop him from agitating his jaw or shoulder, which he assumed was injured too from the pain. He looked around, wondering where his mom was. Surely she'd have come to see him if he was injured as badly as that. As if reading his mind, Eraser, Izuku was sure he was, answered his unvoiced question. "Mrs. Midoriya is on her way. She left to get some things she thought you'd want." Izuku gave them another thumbs up before trying to focus on remembering the small amount of sign language he'd been forced to learn in a school workshop. He could remember the alphabet, but that was about it. Well, that was good enough. "What happened?" Izuku spelled out carefully and slowly, trying not to mess up the letters, making eye contact with Eraserhead as he did so, hoping the hero would understand. "You know sign language?" Eraser asked, apparently intrigued, although he didn't show it in his face or voice. "Just letters," Izuku replied. The hero nodded before responding to his original question. "I found you beat up in an alleyway with multiple burns and a broken jaw," Eraserhead explained bluntly, the doctor nodding along to his claims. "You had 2 major burns on your left shoulder and upper back, as well as multiple minor burns on your arms and torso. Severe bruising in most places that were not burned, as well as a broken jaw." The doctor clarified his injuries. "Burns? Wait, oh!" Izuku remembered what had happened to him. Kachan leaving him in that alley after beating him into unconsciousness, and apparently injuring him more than Izuku had thought. "Izuku!" A panicked yell in a voice he knew like the back of his hand. His mother, who burst back into the room seconds later, carrying the old bright yellow backpack, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. "You're awake! Thank goodness!" After a rushed conversation between Inko and the doctor, his mom came over to him, placing the bag down on the chair next to his bed and rummaging through it, pulling his phone, which Eraser had given back to her when she arrived, out and giving it to him. "You can use that to talk to us," Inko smiled, gently ruffling her son's hair. Izuku gave her a grateful look, unlocking his phone with one hand and opening the Notes app, typing something in. "Hi Mom, sorry for worrying you," he typed. Inko teared up, giving Izuku a wobbly smile. "I'm your mom. It's my job to worry about you. I'm just glad you're okay." Half an hour later, Izuku was just about ready to go back to sleep. The doctor and his mom had been over his recovery time. He'd have to stay home for at least a month to allow his injuries to heal properly. Izuku wasn't sure this was a bad thing, and he would only be able to eat soft foods and liquids for the next 6 weeks until his jaw was healed properly. The actual treatment he'd have to do seemed pretty simple, just changing bandages and burn cream, nothing terrible. Unfortunately for Izuku, however, his sleep would be put back a little longer as Eraserhead walked back into the room, a look of annoyance on his face, though that just might be his resting face. Izuku wasn't sure. "What's up, Eraserhead?" Izuku showed the man his phone screen, a small smile on his face. He still hadn't gotten over the fact that one of his favorite heroes had been the one to find him. Eraser's eyes widened momentarily in surprise, having not expected Izuku to know who he was. Not many people did, after all.
But the look didn't last long as he composed himself. "Okay, problem child. What's with the nickname already? The police are going to be here to question you and take your statement about this within the next week. Your injuries are too bad to be self-inflicted, meaning that someone must have done it to you. I just want to ask my own questions before they come barging in here." Izuku visibly paled. How can I get out of this? I can't tell them that Kachan did it. He'd be charged with assault and bullying, if they found out. Then he wouldn't be able to get to UA, and he wouldn't be a hero, and it would be my fault. And if Kachan didn't get to be a hero, I can't lie to this police, but I'm not good at lying about things like this, and then what am I supposed to do? "You okay, kid? You spaced out?" the doctor asked, snapping her fingers in front of his face and bringing him out of his thoughts. Izuku nodded. "I just want to know who did this to you." "Will he be in trouble?" Izuku replied, typing slower on his phone that time, trying to pick the right words. "Most likely," Aizawa admitted, noting the passing look of terror that crossed Izuku's face before he carefully brought his look back to neutral. "I can't tell you," was Izuku's next message. Eraser huffed. "We're going to find out either way, kid. It'll be easier if you just tell us," Aizawa told him, as an annoyed look on his face. Izuku tried to shake his head, not doing much other than causing himself pain. But he deserved it, didn't he? He was going to be the reason Kachan wouldn't achieve his dreams. "Can't," he typed, trying to emphasize the obvious panic. Aizawa saw the tears in his eyes as he stared. Okay, kid, calm down," Aizawa told him. "You don't have to talk to me, but the police will want to know too, and it might be easier to tell me first." Izuku thought about it for a minute. On one hand, Eraserhead was a hero. He would probably tell the police and Kachan would get in trouble. But he'd have to tell the police anyway. He couldn't lie to the police, after all. He'd get in trouble for that. But for Kachan's sake, that probably wouldn't work, would it? So Kachan would get in trouble whatever the way he took. That left the question as to which would get him into the least trouble. Well, the police would take it at face value. They'd give him the charge he deserved without consideration for Izuku trying to convince them otherwise. But maybe, hopefully, Razorhead would be more lenient. "Can the others leave?" Izuku showed his phone to Aizawa again, giving him an hopeful look. Eraserhead nodded. "Both of you leave the room so we could have this conversation in private." Eraserhead said the nurse, nodding, and left, assuming that whatever the hero wanted was important. Inka was a little more hesitant until Izuku gave her a look, and she nodded, leaving the room as well. "So, you're going to tell me then, kid?" Aizawa asked Izuku, sitting down on one of the spare chairs in the room. Izuku started typing, his fingers on one hand flying across the keyboard, and when he was done, he turned the phone to Aizawa, having typed the whole essay. "It's my fault, not his. I was avoiding him for months. He thought that I thought I was better than him. I don't. He's amazing and he'll make a great pro. But he can't do that if he has charges for hurting me on his record. I can't do that to him. It'd be my fault. It would crush his dreams and it would be my fault. I don't want to ruin his chances." Aizawa stopped reading halfway through the paragraph, knowing it would just be more of Izuku standing up for whoever did this. Who hurt him? "Kid, I get it, okay? You don't want him to get in trouble." Aizawa sighed. This wasn't just a mindset someone got overnight. This was ingrained in Izuku's head. That everything was his fault and whoever he was talking about was so much better than him. Do you really think that someone who can be a hero if they hurt someone like this? Aizawa asked Izuku. Is beating someone unconscious the actions of a hero? The amount of thoughts running through Izuku's head were obvious from the look on his face. Even with a broken jaw and a neck brace. After a few seconds though, Izuku picked up the phone again. Heroes beat up villains all the time. If it is for the good of everyone else, then yes, it is the actions of a hero. How exactly was beating you up good for everyone? Eraser asked him. The kid obviously thought he did something wrong. Maybe Izuku would tell him who if he managed to get through him. I avoided him. I was probably being annoying. I'm useless and worthless. Everyone hates me. The list goes on. Eraser sighed. This kid got issues. Kid, why would everyone hate you? Plus, even if you were being annoying. If you didn't attempt or succeed to physically harm him, you did nothing to deserve being injured, especially to this extent. He tried to explain. I deserved it. I'm useless and stupid and annoying and... Can you tell me who it was? Aizawa interrupted him, trying to stop his self-depreciating ramblings. My childhood friend, Izuku wrote slowly, questioning every letter he wrote. Aizawa sighed. That probably was all he will get out for now, and he could work with that. Thanks, kid. Chapter 7. Discharge and Police. It was finally the day Izuku was allowed to go home. A week after Eraser had questioned him, the hero hadn't shown up again after the day he'd woken up here, and Izuku hadn't been allowed to leave the hospital, even though he felt a lot better. Kinda. His jaw still ached, though it was a lot less painful than it was the first few days. But he still wasn't allowed to speak or eat food that would require lots of chewing. The neck brace had been removed 3 days in. Most of the minor burns were scabbed over and already beginning to heal. The major burns were still painful, but a lot less so than before. Most of his bruises were healed now, some of the worst ones still visible. But they'd gone in a few days too. Izuku would be out of the hospital around dinner time, but before then there was a lot he had to do. He knew someone from the police force would be coming to take his statement this morning. Then the doctors would have to do a few tests before they could let him go. He had the police to deal with first. He had to convince them that Kachan was not at fault. My name is Detective Tsukauchi. I'm with the Musutafu Police Department, the detective told him. My quirk is called Human Lie Detector, which means I can tell when you're lying. I'm not sure whether it'll work with you typing, however, I'll do a quick test. Izuku nodded, the gesture not hurting half as much as it had a week ago, and got his phone ready to answer the detective's questions. What's your name? The detective asked, a question he already knew to answer too, the perfect test for his quirk. Izuku Midoriya, Izuku typed, showing the detective, who nodded. It had registered as true, meaning his quirk worked with Izuku typing. Good. Alright, that means we can start. Multiple questions later, with Izuku managing to not give a name or too many clues to an identity while still telling the truth, Tsukauchi was getting just a little frustrated, so he asked outright a question Izuku couldn't dodge. "What is the name of the person who attacked you?" "Kachan," Izuku replied with only a few moments' hesitation. Most of the kids at school knew his childish nickname for the boy, but he doubted the police force had it in their system. Izuku hoped it would register as true, since it was still a name he was called by. Izuku didn't have such luck. "That's false," the detective said, looking expectantly at Izuku for a real answer. "Kachan is a nickname," was Izuku's response. "Will you tell me his real name?" Izuku just shook his head adamantly. Tsukaushi sighed. He didn't want to force the kid to talk. "All right, that's all the questions for now," the detective told him. "I will need a written statement from you, but that can wait until you healed more." Izuku nodded and Tsukauchi left. He had to find out who Kachan was. When Izuku got home later that day with his arm in a sling, so he couldn't jostle his shoulder around too much, the first thing he did was open up his laptop and click onto his YouTube channel. He had been missing for a week after all. A few people were wondering where he was. It seemed by the comments left on his most recent video. Some were more concerned since he updated every few days and he'd been gone for a week now. Others were a little more demanding. For updates, Izuku sighed. He'd have to give them something. Then he noticed his subscriber count. He was on just over 250k. That was a milestone, right? "I have to do something to celebrate. People would be expecting me to make something for it, but I can't exactly make a video like this. What?" Izuku was snapped out of his spiraling thoughts. His mom called him for dinner. He sighed, grabbing his phone, and left the room. He'd think about what to do during dinner. The idea hit him while he was staring into his soup, not really wanting to eat, as moving his jaw was still painful. Even though he wouldn't have to chew it, eating wasn't a nice process right now. He decided to make a Ryoku community Discord server, so he could still talk to people who liked his content. It would be a good celebration of the milestone, opening a Discord server for 250k subs. A way to help a lot of people and engage in the community he'd apparently created somehow. He still wasn't exactly sure why all these people were here. His analysis wasn't all that impressive. They could easily get it somewhere else. He wasn't exactly funny or engaging, so he had no idea why people were interested. But they were, and Izuku figured he should just accept that. So after dinner he posted a message on his community feed, explaining vaguely what had happened and what was going on. "Hi everyone! I first of all want to thank all of you for your support. I never thought I'd reach a milestone like 250k when I first started out, so thank you! I'm glad you decided to stick around. Unfortunately, due to personal circumstances, I won't be able to film videos properly for the next few weeks. I hope everyone will be understanding and patient while I get back to being able to post, which would hopefully be in a few weeks. In the meantime, I am working on a surprise, well, I'll probably announce within the next week, so look around for that. Ryuko." Izuku read over the post multiple times, checking and correcting what he'd written before hitting the post button, before he could think too hard about it and chicken out. Once he'd done that, he got to work creating a Discord server. First he'd need an account. Bakugo would never admit it, but he was worried. The nerd hadn't shown up for school in a week and a half. Had he really hurt him that bad? Usually when Bakugo beat him up, the nerd would be back within a few days, at most with some self-applied bandages, but this time was different. Had he gone too far? What if he's dead? That thought made his breath catch in his throat. Had Katsuki killed the nerd? What if he was dead? It was undoubtedly Katsuki's fault. He didn't want to be responsible for that. Shit! Maybe he should call Auntie Inko and ask. But if he was dead, she'd be grieving. God damn it! What had he done? Katsuki shook his head. The nerd wasn't dead. If he was, the hag would have told him about that. Instead of dwelling on that for too long, Katsuki looked at his phone screen. He had clicked on a new community post from Ryuko almost as soon as it popped up. He wasn't waiting for it. Of course not. Why would he do that? But he may have been hoping that the YouTuber would update again after saying he was out of commission for a few days ago. The post was inviting his community to join a Discord server he'd created as a celebration for the subscriber milestone. That was the surprise he'd promised in the last post, apparently. Katsuki didn't know if he should join or not. Apparently he wouldn't get a chance because there was a knock on the door which the hag went to open. Were they having some fucking guests over or something? "Does Katsuki Bakugo live here?" asked some official-sounding man. Katsuki grunted, pocketing his phone and leaving his room to lean over the banister to see what was going on. There were police at his door. "What the fuck?" "Yes," the hag answered. "What did my son do?" "He's suspected for a case of physical assault. We just want to ask a few questions," the man, who looked more like a detective than a policeman, said. "Physical assault?" the hag barked. "My Katsuki? He's an aggressive kid, but he wouldn't assault someone." "We have reason to believe otherwise, ma'am," the detective said politely. "Please just let us speak to your son." Katsuki stomped down the stairs, glaring at everyone present. You must be Katsuki Bakugo?" the detective said, ignoring the deathly glare Katsuki sent his way. "My name is Detective Tsukoshi, and I have some questions for you." Chapter 8. Ryoku analyzes official Discord server. Being stuck home wasn't half as bad as Izuku expected. His mom had pushed him to enroll in an online school during the time he'd have to be out of Aldera, which he'd done. He'd taken to this style of learning quickly. It was a lot nicer to be able to go at his own pace, which he was surprised to find was faster than at school. He'd taken the semester courses in the subjects he was already studying: math, Japanese, English, and science, as well as a few extra subjects that the online school offered: art to improve the art on his notebooks, and quark theory, which he just thought sounded interesting. Izuku found that it was also pretty nice to not have people laughing at you, cheering and whispering behind your back. It was also nice not to have Ka-chan's glare boring into him whenever he did so much as move. Plus, he knew that if he went back to Aldera now, he'd probably be made fun of even more for being unable to speak and move properly. No one would care where his injuries had come from, nor make a point to listen to him if he filed a report. Which he wouldn't do, of course. He didn't want to ruin Ka-chan's chances of getting into UA and achieving his dreams. What is Ka-chan doing right now? Had the police worked out who he is? They probably had. Izuku knew they had talked to his mom as well as him. He knew she would have told them who the nickname belonged to if they asked for her, which they almost definitely would have. Knowing that Ka-chan was probably going to face some form of charge for this hurt Izuku more than the injuries the boy had given him, because it was his fault, wasn't it? It was Izuku's fault that Kachan had needed to beat him up. He had been annoying and avoiding him, right? So it would be his fault that Kachan wouldn't be able to follow his dream. A dream that was realistic, a dream that was no longer shared by Izuku himself. A thought hit him then, something Izuku hadn't really expected. Was it my fault? Did I deserve this? Izuku thought for a second. It was his fault, wasn't it? But had he really deserved injuries that required surgery? He remembered from the conversation that he'd had with Eraserhead back in the hospital, when the hero had tried to convince him that it wasn't his fault. If you didn't attempt or succeed to physically harm him, you did nothing to deserve being injured. Eraser had said that he didn't deserve it. Maybe he was right. He was a hero after all, but then again, what was one good hero in a world where everyone else was against him? Izuku had sat thinking about this for hours, as he laid in bed, unable to fall asleep that night because of the thoughts buzzing around in his head. It was giving him a headache to just think about it anymore. He made his Discord server public the next morning. He had been working on it for the last 3 days after making the first announcement. It had been surprisingly easy, having never even used the platform before, to work out what was going on and how it worked. It was difficult to forget about last night's crisis, but he'd pushed it to the back of his mind so he could focus his attention on the task at hand. He'd tried to make the server as interesting and inclusive as possible, having rules in place for the protection of his fans. He tried to make it so that no one would be made to feel unwelcome. Izuku knew he'd have to get together some kind of admin team to moderate the server, but that should wait a few days. The admins had to be people he knew well enough to trust, which means he'd have to find some good people from his fan base since he had no friends in real life. The server had blown up almost as soon as he posted the second announcement with the invite link. Within the first hour, the server already had around 300 members. He'd read every introduction post in his channel he'd set up and was happy to see that his community was so diverse from age to nationality. He didn't realize he'd have fans in other countries, but apparently he did. Izuku couldn't help but smile as he talked with some of his fans. One girl, he presumed, since she'd taken the she-her pronoun role out of the list he had set up, had replied to him with a key smash when he actually talked to her. He thought it was odd at first, then other people started reacting the same way. People really liked him enough to act like he was some viral celebrity? Did people actually panic about talking to him? There were multiple conversations already going on in the general chats. It was nice to see people talking, even if it was about eating chocolate and cheese together and the fact that escalators were apparently the coolest invention in human history. These people were weird, and Izuku found he had zero problem with that as he happily joined the conversation, causing a light-hearted debate over the ethics of dipping McDonald's fries in milkshake. He'd gotten into an interesting conversation in someone's called Sleepy Cat 2014's DMs after being sent a question about his opinions on the villain quirks, which had become a full-fledged joint rant on the issues of quirk discrimination. It seemed that the person had what people labeled a villain quirk. They'd had a very similar opinion in the matter. The conversation had turned into talking about cats and whether Eraserhead, who was happy to find someone else who knew about the hero, was a fan of them or not, and from what he'd ended up talking to this random person for the best part of 5 hours. All in all, the server was a good idea. to record as soon as he could speak, of course. The next job on his long list was to create himself an admin team. So far there hadn't really been an issue on the server. Someone had suggested a blacklist for any triggers that people had, which he'd thought was a good idea and added instantly. He'd internally debated whether he should put recordings of explosion quirks on said blacklist. Half an hour later he decided yes, he should. Everyone was supposed to be comfortable here, and everyone included him, right? For the admin team he ended up DMing a couple people who he'd been speaking to a little more than others. Sleepycat 2014 was one of them. The first person he'd DM'd since they talked a lot in DMs and they got along well, which was surely the most interesting interaction out of all of them. Ryoku analyzes. Hey, I was thinking about creating an admin team for the server. You wanna be part of it? Izuku had decided to keep the request message chill. He didn't want to do formal that well, and honestly, messages like that felt a little patronizing. Sleepycat 2014. What? You want me to be an admin? Why? Ryoku analyzes. Figured you'd say something like that. I probably know you best out of everyone in the server. I trust you not to cause mass chaos as soon as I give you the role, and I think you'd make a good admin. Sleepycat 2014. Fair enough. I guess. But seriously, you want me? Me? Izuku shook his head, looking at the messages laced with obvious self-doubt, something he was way too familiar with. Ryoku analyzes. Yes, you, silly, you're my friend. Are we friends? And as much as I tried to make you sleep, you seem to be around 24/7 anyway. Sleepycat 2014. I guess we're friends. Insomnia sucks, and if you're really serious, then I'd be honored to be your admin. Ryoku analyzes. Awesome! See you in the admin channel that I still have to make. Sleepycat just sent back laughing emoticons before going offline. Izuku laughed at his phone before heading onto the server, quickly creating the aforementioned admin channel before heading into this next target's DMs. He'd put his phone down after DMing some other user he knew that was one of the hero students from the UK who was fluent in Japanese. So she wouldn't be up for a few more hours unless he had another insomniac on his hands, and the other two users he asked also hadn't been online at the time, so he decided he'd wait a while. 3 hours later, after eating dinner, yet another kind of soup, he was fully ready to go back to eating normal soup ASAP. He checked the Discord notifications again. He'd had 2 replies. The third was still offline. Both the British girl, British Bread, Izuku loved the username for no specific reason, and someone who hadn't specified much about themselves but seemed super nice in conversation with the username Stealing Your Sadness, had responded to him. British Bread had seemingly smashed her face into the keyboard multiple times. The amount of key smashes in the paragraph she'd written in response to Izuku's request made him smile. He was glad to make people happy. He was even happier when he deciphered her message to confirm she'd said yes. Stealing Your Sadness had been a lot more straightforward, telling Izuku that she was surprised he picked her of all people, but was happy to help if she could. So now Izuku had his ragtag group of admins, minus the last person he hoped would reply soon. They all seemed to get along well, especially Sadness and Sleepycat. They both gave him insomniac vibes. Maybe he'd have to look up how to make people sleep at some point? Izuku shook his head with a sigh. This was going to be a few good weeks. Chapter 9. Guilty as Charged. Bakugo stared the detective down, doing his best to look intimidating, sitting opposite the plain-looking man in the grey, empty interrogation room. He'd been brought here on the basis that it would be private. Yeah, right. Katsuki knew there were cameras and recording devices all over the place. He wasn't stupid. And he wouldn't have to talk in front of his mother. Not that he actually cared, but he'd agreed to come to the police station for the questioning anyway. It meant he could put it off a little longer. Bakugo knew for a fact that they weren't questioning everyone from the school. Fingers would have texted him with a warning if they were. But it would have been better if they were. He wondered if the entirety of the blame would be put on him. Damn the fucking nerd. He'd never get into UA with something like this on his record. He'd known what this was about the moment the word assault came out of the detective's mouth. Back at his house, Bakugo was sure Deku hadn't told anyone purposefully. He knew the nerd too well for that, at least. Had Katsuki really hurt Deku enough for an assault charge? "My name is Detective Tsukauchi," the detective told him, breaking the uncomfortable silence with his tired-sounding voice. "I'm going to ask you a few questions. My quirk is called Human Lie Detector, meaning I know if you lie."
Yeah, whatever.
Bakugo rolled his eyes, trying to sound as bored as possible.
Just get on with it.
"Are you Kachan?" The detective's first question caught Bakugo off guard, his eyes widening a little before he trained his expression back onto one of disinterest.
"Yeah? What's with it? The nerd's calling me that."
Bakugo answered after a second. He figured there was no point in trying to lie if this detective was serious about his quirk. The look in the detective's eyes told Bakugo that the answer to that question was all the man needed to know, that Katsuki deserved whatever charge he was planning to give him. He knew that the next questions were unnecessary, but they were asked anyway, to Bakugo's annoyance. "Did you attack Izuku Midoriya on Monday, September 3rd? The detective asked.
"Yeah,"
Katsuki answered with a gruff sigh. He didn't want to give out more information than was asked for. Maybe he could avoid extra damage doing that. Katsuki knew it was wishful thinking, but he wasn't going to lose his head over the shit either. "Do you know the extent of the injuries you caused him?" Now this question caught Katsuki off guard. His mind reeled back a little. During the event he hadn't really paid much attention to how much he actually hurt the stupid nerd. He never did. He simply let his rage control him. So the answer was no. He didn't know what the extent of the injuries he'd caused was. So that's what he said. "Midoriya had 2 severe second-degree burns, not quite third, but close. A broken jaw that required surgery and many bad bruises," Tsukauchi told him. "He had to remain in the hospital for a week and still need to stay off of school for the next 6. Katsuki hid his surprise. He knew that it hadn't shown on his face because he forced it away, but was it seriously that bad? Had he really hurt Deku that much? Usually it was only a few minor burns and bruises, right? Had he really? If he hadn't been found by the hero who brought him to the hospital, there's a real chance that he would have died." Katsuki couldn't hide the surprise this time. The look of near horror flashed across his face, definitely noticed by Tsukauchi. "Did you mean to nearly kill him?" The detective already knew the answer, but he needed to ask for solid evidence. "No," Katsuki replied, "just to put him in his place." "His place being?"
"He's quirkless, a useless hero wannabe. His place is at the bottom,
Katsuki told the detective, though for the first time in 10 years he wasn't fully sure about the statement. You consider that a good reason to beat him up, even if you weren't aiming to kill him? Takauchi asked, grimacing. What was up with kids these days? Yeah, Bakugo replied. The note of unsureness in his voice was obvious to the detective, who made the quick note of that. A few questions later and Bakugo had been sent home from the station, being told to come back the next day after school to find out what would happen to him, how this might affect his record and what he'd have to do about it. Katsuki shouldered open his door after aggressively unlocking it, having to fight his instincts and not blow up the keyring in the process. That fucking detective! Making him question himself and his opinions! Fucking hell! He growled as though a thought ran through his head. He knew he'd get a mark on his record at the very least for this. Could he still get into UA with a criminal record? How was he supposed to come back from almost killing someone? Even if that someone was a Deku, a quirkless nobody who'd just been a pebble in his path. A pebble that had tripped him up because he hadn't been paying enough attention to the pavement. Katsuki, you're back! Did they let you go? Mitsuki Bakugo yelled, running down the hallway towards Katsuki. He huffed, glaring at the woman. I have to go back tomorrow so they can process my interrogation, Katsuki told her before pushing past and going for the stairs. Are you trying to tell me that they're right? That you assaulted someone? The hag yelled. Katsuki turned with an angry sigh. Will you shut the fuck up already, you hag? Katsuki yelled. Yes, they're fucking right! Katsuki Bakugo! His mother screeched. How dare you talk to me like that? You get down here and tell me what the hell you did! Bakugo simply rolled his eyes and stumped up the stairs, locked himself in his room. He'd be thrown himself onto his bed and pulled out his phone, unlocking it to find himself faced with the Discord server invite he'd forgotten. He'd been looking at that before the police had shown up to his doorstep. He clicked the join server after only a moment's hesitation before throwing his phone down. He'd look at that later. The next day Katsuki returned to the police station after school, which had significantly calmed down now that the main target of everyone's bullying has gone missing. The peace and quiet was new to Katsuki. He didn't know how exactly to feel about it, especially since he was the one responsible. He told the receptionist, a guy with a cat head, that he was here to see the detective from yesterday. Once he'd given a name, the cat man told him to wait while he went to get the man Bakugo was after. Good. Bakugo, you're here, Takauchi said, sitting down at the small table in the waiting room opposite of the blonde, with a wad of papers in his hands that he immediately tapped on the table before beginning to finger through them, pulling a few free of the stack and pushing them towards Bakugo. Now about your charge, Takauchi told him, meeting his eyes as Bakugo huffed. You assaulted your classmate, severely injuring him. Although the amount of damage hadn't been purposeful, the original attack had been. Yeah, I know already. Just tell me what I have to do, Bakugo interrupted, annoyed. Right, well, first of all, this is absolutely going to go on your record. However, we won't be sending you to prison or something similar unless something like that happens again. Katsuki let out a quiet huff in relief, thinking he'd gotten off scot-free. However, although this isn't Being brought to court, Inko Midoriya has filed a restraining order on you, meaning you won't be able to get close to Midoriya, Tsukochi told him. Bakugo honestly wasn't surprised. It made sense, him being kept away from the damn nerd. As well as this, you'll be attending mandatory therapy, the detective finished, especially for your anger, but also to deal with some other issue I noticed during the questioning yesterday. Shit. So now he'd have to do some dumb mandatory therapy as a perfect little add-on to a criminal record that would make it so he couldn't get into UA. He couldn't be a hero if he had a criminal record after all. Chapter 10. The Question. Katsuki had a lot to think about when he got home that day. The hag kept asking who he'd beaten up. Katsuki knew that if it was someone who deserved it, she'd stomp down to the police station and try to get him out of the charges. And Deku had deserved it, right? But really, he was just quirkless. Did he really deserve to nearly die? Katsuki groaned and shook his head. This was really messing with him. Deciding he needed some kind of distraction, Katsuki shut himself in his room once again and opened up the Discord app on his phone. Looking at the server he'd joined the day before, but hadn't even looked at yet. Good enough. He'd read through the rules and regulations and was now reading through the server's blacklist. Katsuki groaned. All this shit was excessive, wasn't it? Having a load of regulations for what he could and couldn't say? Recordings of explosion quirks. The fuck? He guessed he wouldn't be showing off his quirk around here then. As much as he hated these excessive rules, this was Ryoku's server. He didn't want to be kicked off for something as stupid as not following the damn blacklist, even if he thought it was stupid. Bakugo couldn't care less about the conversations going on in the general chats. These guys were all dumb extras. They didn't even matter. He took a mental note of who was the admin were before scrolling through the channels. Most of them seemed pretty boring. Stuff he couldn't care less about. Extras posting art and talking about shit that had happened to them. He found a channel where you could ask Ryoku questions. Most of the questions people posted here were about heroes or quirks, or something he'd said in a video along the lines like, "When will you start posting again?" of course. Bakugo considered asking a question in the channel. He wanted to know if he could still go to UA with a criminal record. But he didn't need help. He shouldn't need to ask someone else to know how to do something. Besides, Ryoku probably didn't even know. Why would he? It wasn't exactly to do with quirks or his channel. He'd probably be better off googling it or asking a teacher or a counselor. They might know. Who was he kidding? His teachers were no good idiots. He doubted that they'd even enforced the damn restraining order Auntie Inko had filed against him. Teachers aren't supposed to turn a blind eye to bullying, sometimes going as far as encouraging it. Even if it was a worthless nerd being bullied, Katsuki doubted that the teachers were supposed to ignore it. Whatever it wasn't like he cared. Katsuki scoffed. This was so stupid. He shouldn't be messing around with some YouTuber server asking questions he could find out on his own. What the hell was wrong with him? He typed out the question already and everything. The pop of his own quirk simultaneously brought him out of his thoughts and sent his phone flying. He was glad he'd have the initiative to buy a blast-resistant phone case. At least he stalked over to grab his phone, small explosions leaving his palms as he did so to burn up the nitroglycerin that had collected there without him noticing. If he started losing track of his thoughts like that, he'd start muttering like the fucking nerd. That was one of the last things he wanted. So without a second thought, he sent the question on the Discord server before throwing his phone across the room again out of sheer annoyance towards himself and collapsed backwards onto his bed. Izuku was caught off guard by the question sent just moments ago. Can I still get into a hero course if I have a criminal record? First of all, the lack of grammar in the questioner. Underscore All Might Fan 1 underscore. Whoever it was seemed to have thought the systems to have the 1 in the name had used in the question was appalling. First of all, but Izuku knew it was just a text, not everyone was like him. Second of all, he never thought he'd be asked something like that. He had been expecting almost all of other kinds of questions he got in the channel, which he tried to answer to the best to his ability, but this was new. Izuku wasn't exactly sure why they had asked him rather than just looking it up, nor was he sure that the answer would be what the other one wanted as well. He hadn't looked into it before since he never had a reason to. However, he wanted to answer the question, so he began to do some research. He'd gone through a couple of hero schools' websites, looking at the entry requirements. A few said that you needed a quirk to get in, which hurt Izuku a little, but that wasn't what he was here for, so it didn't matter. Most schools he looked in, including UA, didn't seem to have any policies against people with criminal records. Izuku found it surprising, since that meant literally anyone could try out, even if they'd broken the law. He guessed it was probably assumed that villains wouldn't try out for hero course anyway, nor would 15 to 16-year-olds be that likely to have a criminal record as well. Still, it would probably be better to have a policy in place. Izuku didn't doubt for a second that they took the students' previous school records, grades and any criminal activity into account before accepting them. But still, there was nothing saying that someone with a criminal record couldn't get into UA or most other schools. So he got back to the person asking the question. Luckily, it hadn't been covered up just yet. I've done a bit of digging for you. Most hero schools in Japan that I looked at don't say anything on their websites about criminal records. However, I highly doubt that it isn't something they'd consider when accepting students. Ultimately, it depends on the severity of the crime on your record. If it was a one-time offense and nothing too major, as long as you did well enough on the entrance exams, for whatever school you're applying to, you could still get in. It would greatly reduce your chances, of course, but it's definitely not impossible. It might be good to check the specific requirements for the school you're trying for, though. Izuku typed out, about to press send before stopping and adding, "Good luck with whatever school you're applying for," before sending the message. He quickly pinged the user afterwards so that they would definitely see the message before diverting his attention to the chaotic conversation going on in the admin channel. Brad was trying to get Sleepy Cat to do, well, sleep, even though it was only 8 p.m. The newest admin, Crimson Riot Supremacy, who's been finally responded to the message the next day, was occasionally adding in onto Brad's comment, the two of them ganging up on poor Sleepy Cat. Izuku laughed at the torment before joining in, his only intentions being chaos.